Everyone thought she was a nobody, until the will named her as the sole heir to a vast fortune. But that was only the beginning. The man everyone mourned appeared alive, revealing a plan years in the making. This wasn't a mistake. It was a test, and almost no one passed. On a cold November morning in the quiet town of Bridgewater, Maine, a row of expensive SUVs lined the curb outside the law office on Main Street. The building's stone facade cast long shadows on the sidewalk as a steady stream of well-dressed men and women entered through the polished oak doors. They were the relatives, business partners, and former associates of Henry Burton, the town's former mayor and the owner of its largest construction company. A month earlier, he had been declared dead after his fishing boat was found capsized on Sugar Pond. No body was recovered, only his jacket and tackle box. Local newspapers ran headlines of loss and legacy, hailing the end of an era. Inside the law office, the waiting room had been converted into a ceremonial chamber. The scent of leather and wood polish mixed with the bitter trace of fresh coffee. The floor gleamed with clean lines of parquet, and the chairs, thick and high-backed, were arranged in tidy rows facing a long walnut table. Conversations hummed under the low light of hanging brass fixtures. People murmured about property, assets, and the shares Henry had left behind. The tone was one of quiet calculation masked as grief. Then the door creaked open, and a sudden hush rippled through the room. A woman stepped inside, alone, unannounced, and out of place. She wore a worn gray coat that hung loosely from her shoulders, frayed at the sleeves. Her boots were scuffed and softened by years of wear. In her hand, she carried a plain canvas bag, faded and heavy at the seams. Her hair was tied back in a low bun, and her face was bare of makeup, weathered but composed. Without speaking, she walked to the back of the room and took the seat nearest the window. She didn't look around. Her posture was still, reserved, almost cautious. A few heads turned. Someone near the front exchanged a glance with a cousin. One of the younger women pulled out her phone under the table and snapped a quick photo, hiding a smirk. A man near the aisle leaned sideways and whispered something that drew a low laugh from his neighbor. Another, seated across from her, squinted and muttered that she must have wandered in from the shelter across the street. No one approached her. No one asked her name. She was simply there, a quiet anomaly among polished shoes and pearl earrings. Her presence unsettled the tone of the room, just enough to stir discomfort. But she didn't flinch, didn't shift. She kept her eyes forward, focused on nothing in particular, like someone waiting for something no one else expected. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as the crowd grew restless. The hum of small talk turned sharper, more brittle. Shoulders squared, arms crossed, and the occasional forced laugh echoed against the wood-paneled walls. The woman in the worn coat remained still, seated near the back, her canvas bag resting on her knees, her gaze fixed ahead. But the attention on her only deepened. Glances became longer, more deliberate. A few whispered exchanges turned into open sneers. The daughter of Henry Burton Taylor stood with a posture honed by confidence and entitlement. Her voice carried across the room as she made a pointed remark, loud enough to ensure it reached the ears it was meant for. Heads turned in agreement. A subtle but unmistakable wave of approval moved through the space, as if the discomfort she caused had been validated. Near the tall windows, Mark and Doug, Henry's sons, stood murmuring in amusement. One of them lifted his phone and with a sly glance began recording the woman, panning deliberately from her boots to her expressionless face. They laughed under their breath, shielding their amusement behind their tailored jackets. Not far from them, a young woman in a pearl necklace leaned into a friend's shoulder, covering her mouth to hide a smirk. Her eyes never left the figure in the corner. Someone passed a folded napkin down a row of chairs. It changed hands without comment until it reached a young man seated behind the woman. He glanced around, then slipped it beneath her seat. In bold black ink, one word was written across it: outsider. The atmosphere thickened. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was judgment, coated in mockery, sharpened by class. Whispers morphed into confidently spoken theories. People speculated about the woman's connection to Henry. Some suggested she had been a housekeeper. Others believed she was an opportunist who had shared a brief secret chapter in his life and now came seeking scraps from his estate. More than one person remarked on her boots, their cracked leather and flattened soles. Laughter followed, quiet but cruel. A man from the finance side of Henry's affairs, dressed in a blazer with a crest stitched over the pocket, let out a louder than necessary chuckle. He joked to a cluster of listeners that poverty was starting to look like a protest, and this woman had apparently come dressed for battle. They laughed with him, appreciative of the showmanship. When the lawyer finally approached her, the room took notice. He leaned down, asked her something quietly, then nodded and returned to his place at the front. Most didn't hear the name she gave, but her mere presence at the heart of official business unsettled the others. A few faces shifted with suspicion. Their thoughts sharpened. If she wasn't an accident, she must be a threat. From that moment, she was no longer invisible. She was something worse, a disruption they couldn't explain and couldn't dismiss. At precisely noon, the tall double doors opened and a hush fell over the room. Arthur Henderson, Henry Burton's longtime attorney, stepped inside with measured steps. He carried a thick leather briefcase in one hand and a sealed white envelope in the other. His presence alone demanded order. The room, once filled with chatter and rising tension, shifted into silence as he made his way to the long walnut table at the front. He laid the envelope down with care, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the room. His eyes paused, briefly but deliberately, on the unfamiliar woman in the back. Then, without ceremony, he opened the envelope and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. He smoothed it flat and began to read aloud. The air changed with the very first paragraph. Henry Burton, being of sound mind and judgment, had left the entirety of his estate, his business holdings, real estate, bank accounts, and personal effects to Rachel Harmon. A woman no one had acknowledged moments before had just been named the sole beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar legacy. The words hung in the room like smoke. Disbelief flickered across faces like a chain reaction. A murmur began near the front and spread quickly. Then came a voice from the back, sharp, raised. Mark Burton stood, his chair scraping the floor behind him. His outburst echoed. Taylor, still seated, called for a pause in the proceedings, demanding an explanation. Around them, others joined the clamor. Some shouted accusations. Others laughed in short, incredulous bursts. The name had meant nothing to them, until now. Henderson remained composed. He waited until the noise began to settle before reaching into his briefcase once more. One by one, he presented documents for verification. A legally recognized marriage certificate dated 5 years prior, financial records showing joint accounts, photographs taken in New Hampshire, where Henry and Rachel were pictured together on the porch of a modest house. In one, they were fishing. In another, they walked through an autumn forest, hand in hand. Their smiles were quiet, natural, unposed. Henderson moved to a small monitor near the table and, with a few keystrokes, played video footage. It had been recorded by a mounted camera inside the New Hampshire cabin. Henry and Rachel appeared on screen in real time, cooking together, laughing over something unspoken. They looked nothing like the man and woman described in whispered rumors and assumptions. They looked like two people who had chosen each other long before this day. The crowd's resistance faltered. Disbelief gave way to stunned silence. Some leaned forward in their chairs. Others sat back, arms crossed, their mouths drawn into thin, tight lines. Several looked down, as if unwilling to meet one another's eyes. The only movement came from the woman in the back, Rachel, who remained still, her gaze fixed on the screen. She didn't react. Her face was unreadable, untouched by either triumph or bitterness. The inheritance had been decided long before they entered that room. But the true revelation was unfolding now, not in the will, but in the faces of those who had assumed it would belong to them. After the footage ended, a stillness lingered in the room. Arthur Henderson reached into his briefcase once more and removed a handwritten letter. The envelope, yellowed slightly at the corners, bore Henry Burton's name in bold, familiar script. Henderson unfolded the pages with a kind of reverence, then began to read, his voice steady and deliberate. The letter had been written not recently, but nearly a year earlier. In it, Henry revealed the truth that few in the room had suspected, and fewer still would accept without resistance. 6 years prior, he had received a cancer diagnosis. The prognosis was uncertain, but the experience had jolted him. For the first time, the image he had built of himself, mayor, businessman, provider, began to crack. He described how, in the months that followed, he realized most people around him responded only to the version of him they needed, the version with power, wealth, and influence, not the man beneath it all. He chose to disappear not out of fear, but out of necessity. He stepped away from boardrooms, galas, and city council meetings, and into a rented cottage deep in the forests of northern Maine. There, with no headlines or obligations, he attempted to find out who he was without the structures that had always defined him. It was in that solitude he met Rachel. She had come through a local community program, volunteering part-time, with those in medical or emotional need. She had been quiet, deliberate, and unbothered by his name. He wrote that her kindness came without performance, her presence without expectations. At first, she helped him with simple tasks, organizing medications, preparing meals, but eventually she stayed, not out of obligation but because something between them had taken root, slow and certain. He wrote that with her, he was not a title or a legacy, he was just Henry. In the letter, he explained that he had kept their relationship private, not out of shame, but out of caution. He feared his children, accustomed to inheritance and entitlement, would see her as a threat, not as the woman who had walked with him through illness, uncertainty, and renewal. He did not want her reduced to a debate or a rumor. He wanted her protected, cherished, and left in peace. He had written the will years ago while still of sound mind and health, and had updated it multiple times, legally and with full clarity. But the true purpose of his disappearance, he wrote, was not simply retreat, it was revelation. He wanted to see what would remain of those he left behind when his authority was no longer in the room. Would compassion surface without the weight of inheritance? Would decency appear without promise of gain? As Henderson read those final lines, the letter seemed to press on every corner of the room. It was not just a testament, it was a mirror. And in its reflection, few liked what they saw. Rachel sat motionless, hands folded over the canvas bag in her lap, her eyes focused on nothing and everything at once. For a moment, the room had no more words, only reckoning. The days following the reading of the will brought no peace to the quiet town of Bridgewater. In place of resolution came chaos, first in whispers, then in headlines. Local media descended with questions, theories, and accusations. Reporters gathered outside the law office, outside Rachel's temporary lodging, and outside the long-locked gates of Henry Burton's estate. News outlets competed with one another, each spinning a version of the story that suited their audience best. Some articles painted Rachel as a manipulator, a quiet schemer who had preyed on an aging man in isolation. Others suggested she had been his caretaker, nurse, or worse, his illusion. They speculated on her past, her financial history, her education. Rumors emerged from those who had never known her but claimed to have seen her once in passing, always attaching drama where facts were absent. Still others turned their scrutiny toward Henry's children. These stories questioned their absence in his final years, their apparent shock, their fury during the will reading. Editorials asked why a man like Henry had chosen to vanish in the first place, and what that might say about those who had once surrounded him. Lines were drawn, alliances formed in silence. The town itself seemed to lean forward, waiting for another revelation. Through it all, Rachel remained invisible. She didn't attend social events, didn't respond to direct questions, didn't appear on camera. When she finally emerged, it was on a gray morning under a slate sky, outside the same building where the will had been read. Reporters gathered like birds before a storm, recording every movement, every breath. She spoke plainly, her voice quiet but unwavering. She confirmed the will's validity, expressed gratitude to those who had supported her, and stated clearly that she had no intention of running Henry's businesses. A portion of the estate, she said, would be directed toward public service, charity efforts, educational programs, and scholarships for underprivileged youth in the county. She made no apologies. She offered no resentment. When asked about those who had insulted her, she answered only that trust, once broken, was rarely restored with words. Her appearance was brief, and she left with the same calm detachment she had carried into the reading days earlier. But the moment lingered, captured in slow motion by every camera. It should have been the end of the story. Instead, the next twist came from a junior journalist out of Boston. Buried in an afternoon blog post was a single, staggering line. Henry Burton had been seen, alive. The report included a blurry photograph taken outside a corner cafe. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the unmistakable profile of someone once in every local newspaper. His face was partially obscured by a cap and scarf, but speculation ignited instantly. Skeptics dismissed it as a look-alike, a conspiracy-fueled fantasy. Others latched onto it with fervor. Phone lines lit up, forums flooded with theories, the letter, the footage, the timing. It all began to feel too orchestrated, too controlled. Then at sunrise the following morning, all speculation ended. Henry Burton stepped onto the front porch of the law office in Bridgewater. He wore a simple coat and weathered shoes. He looked tired, but unmistakably alive. A silence fell over the growing crowd on the street. Not the silence of peace, but of a reckoning deferred. Everything that had been assumed, feared, or manipulated was now, once again, uncertain. The storm had not passed. It had only begun. On the morning Henry entered the hall, the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a gathering. People sat rigidly in their chairs, as if awaiting a verdict they never expected to hear from the man they had believed dead. When he appeared, there were no theatrics, no grand entrance. He simply walked through the door in a modest coat, nodded to the few people who dared meet his eyes, and took a seat beside Rachel. The silence was total. Conversations died mid-sentence. Movement stilled. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Rachel didn't look at him, but the way her posture softened just slightly was enough to say that she had known he would come. When Henry finally spoke, his voice was calm and even, almost conversational. There was no anger in it, no triumph, only reflection. He spoke of death not as a conclusion, but as a mirror, a temporary absence that revealed permanent truths. He said he had wanted to disappear not out of bitterness, but out of fatigue. He had grown tired of being a symbol, of power, of wealth, of expectation. He had wanted to see what would remain when the image was gone, what people would show when they believed there was nothing left to gain. He explained that everything, the silence, the will, the carefully orchestrated withdrawal, had been part of a deliberate test. Not to punish, but to understand. Who would retain dignity when no one was watching? Who would treat a stranger with decency without knowing her value? Who would claw for scraps at the first cent of inheritance? Then he paused, not for effect, but because he was finished. He stated plainly that the will would remain unchanged. Rachel was his wife, his choice, and the rightful heir to everything he owned. But more than wealth, she had earned his trust. The rest, he said, were welcome to reflect on their own actions in whatever way they saw fit. He announced the formation of a new public foundation, funded from his estate. Its purpose would be to provide education, support, and opportunity for those without voice or title. Participation would be open only to those who had not mocked, belittled, or sought to harm others during the past days. Those who had stayed silent, rather than cruel. Those who had stayed human. A few people rose quietly from their seats and left the room. Some did so in shame, others in disbelief. A handful approached offering words of regret, but he received them with a kind of gentle finality that made further explanation unnecessary. The time for apologies had passed. Within months, Henry's estate had transformed. The main house became a hub for civic programs, job training, legal aid, community lectures. One room was turned into a gallery space, filled with small exhibits honoring ordinary lives, single mothers, retired teachers, immigrants, factory workers. Near the center of the display was a portrait of a woman in a gray coat, sitting quietly in a chair, her hands folded in her lap. A small placard beneath it read, "She arrived unknown, she left unforgettable." Henry never returned to corporate life. He and Rachel remained in the cabin where they had first met. Their days were slow, marked by walks through pine forests and morning coffee on the porch. From time to time they returned to Bridgewater, not for business, but for the community they had helped reshape. No one asked him for favors anymore. There were no meetings scheduled in his name. People greeted him with quiet nods, not because of who he had been, but because of who he had chosen to become. And Rachel, no one called her an outsider again. She belonged not because she inherited the estate, but because she had proven something rare, something permanent. In a room full of noise, she had remained still, and when the storm passed, it was her presence that endured.